Hi friend, a new one again. The Shawshank Redemption, 1994 movies explanation English. I'm doing. Andy Dufresne, Tim Robbins, a Maine banker, is found guilty of murdering his wife and her lover, a golf pro, in 1947. Because Maine does not have a death penalty, he is sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in the notoriously brutal Shawshank prison. Andy maintains his innocence, but his cold, calculated behavior causes everyone to believe he is the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Ellis Boyd Redding, Morgan Freeman, also known as Red, comes up for release after serving 20 years in Shawshank for murder. Red's parole is denied despite his best efforts and demeanor, which doesn't bother him. The local smuggler, Red, is then introduced as someone who can acquire inmates everything they desire within reason. An alarm sounds, alerting all inmates to the arrival of fresh inmates. Red and his pals wager on which new fish will suffer a nervous breakdown on his first night in jail. Red bets a lot. Fat ass, an overweight recently arrived convict, breaks down and tears hysterically on the first night, allowing Haywood, William Sadler, to win the bet. The joy is short-lived, however, when the main guard, Byron Hadley, Clancy Brown, violently beats up the overweight man for refusing to keep quiet when asked. Meanwhile, Andy maintains his cool and composure. The inmates find the next morning that fat ass died in the infirmary when the jail doctor was away for the night. Andy inquires about the man's name. After hearing about Red's ability for discovering items, Andy approaches him around a month later. He requests that Red locate a rock hammer, which he claims is required for his passion of rock collection and carving. Red asks Andy a few questions regarding his objectives, which Andy dismisses with a laugh. Red agrees to place the order, but cautions Andy about the Sisters, a group of female inmates who sexually abuse other inmates, particularly its leader, Boggs, Mark Rolston, who has a thing on Andy. Despite the fact that the other inmates think of Andy as a really frigid fish, Red sees something in him. Red believes Andy wants to use the hammer to arrange an escape in the future, but when he sees the tool's true size, he realizes why Andy laughed and laughs along with him, dismissing the possibility that Andy will use it to dig his way out of prison. Andy spends the first 2 years of his captivity laboring in the prison laundry or battling against Boggs and the Sisters. Andy gets beaten and raped on a regular basis, despite the fact that he actively resists and fights them every time. When a work detail for tarring the roof of one of the prison's buildings is announced, Red works some strings to have Andy and a few mutual acquaintances assigned to the job, providing everyone a respite from the routine. Andy overhears Hadley whining about having to pay taxes on a future inheritance while on the job. Andy uses his experience as a banker to show Hadley how he may avoid paying the IRS by turning his money into a one-time present for his wife. While on the tarring job, he offers to help Hadley fill out the paperwork in exchange for some cool beers for his fellow inmates. Hadley first threatens to throw Andy off the roof, but eventually agrees and do provide the working inmates with cold beers before the job is finished. Red remarks that Andy may have engineered the privilege to build favor with the prison guards as much as with his fellow inmates, but he also thinks Andy did it simply to feel normal again. While watching a movie, Andy approaches Red with another unusual demand and asks for the actress Rita Hayworth. Red is surprised by the demand but agrees to place the order. Hadley threatens to throw Andy from the roof at first, but eventually complies and provides cool beers to the working inmates before the job is completed. Andy may have orchestrated the privilege in order to garner favor with the jail authorities as well as his other convicts, but Red believes Andy did it merely to feel normal again. Andy approaches Red with another weird request while watching a movie, this time for the actress Rita Hayworth. Red is taken aback by the request, but decides. Andy runs into the Sisters again as he departs the theater. Despite his ability to talk himself out of being raped, he is severely beaten to within an inch of his life, forcing him to spend a month in the hospital. Boggs is sentenced to a week in solitary confinement for the beating. When he emerges, he discovers Hadley and his men in his cell. They thrash him so hard that he'll never be able to walk or eat solid food again, and he'll be transported to a prison hospital in upstate New York. The Sisters move on and Andy is never bothered again by them. When Andy emerges from the hospital, he discovers a pile of pebbles to sculpt and a large poster of Rita. When Warren Samuel Norton, Bob Gunton, learns about Andy's assistance to Hadley, he conducts a surprise cell check to assess Andy. While the guards are turning the cell upside down looking for illegal possessions, he finds Andy reading his copy of the Holy Bible and they discuss about their favorite verses. The warden exits, satisfied with their interaction, almost forgetting to return Andy's Bible. Salvation resides within, he says, encouraging Andy to keep reading the Bible. Andy is later informed that he will be working with geriatric convict Brooks Hatlin in the prison library, James Whitmore. The reason for his transfer is made obvious when a prison guard shows up asking Andy for financial advising. Andy sets up a makeshift desk and starts working, providing financial advising to most prison guards and helping them with their income tax returns. Andy also sees an opportunity to expand the prison library. He starts by asking the Maine State Senate for funds. He writes letters every week. His financial support practice is so appreciated that even guards from other prisons, when they visit for inter-prison baseball matches, seek Andy's financial expertise. Even the warden himself has Andy preparing his tax returns. Brooks then cracks and threatens to kill Haywood in order to escape being released from prison. Andy has the ability to calm him down. When his pals talk about Brooks' actions, Red sympathizes with Brooks, who has clearly become institutionalized after 50 years in Shawshank. He has been essentially conditioned to spend the rest of his life as a prisoner and is unable to adapt to the outside world. Remarks in Red, "These are amusing walls. You despise them at first, then grow accustomed to them. After a period of time, you get reliant on them." Brooks is released from prison and is placed in a halfway home. He's also assigned to work in a grocery, which he despises. Finding it difficult to adjust to life out, he eventually commits suicide, leaving a wooden beam with the inscription "Brooks was here" etched on it. Andy receives $200 from the state for the library, along with a collection of ancient books and phonograph records, after 6 years of writing letters. Despite the fact that the state senate believes this will be enough to convince Andy to stop writing letters, he remains undeterred and redoubles his efforts. Andy discovers a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the documents when the contributions of old books and records arrive at the warden's office. He confines the warden's office guard in the restroom and plays the tape over the prison's public address system. The music quickly has the voices of these women, Red observes, made everyone feel free, if only for a brief period. Outside the office, Norton is enraged by Andy's defiance and commands him to switch off the record player. Andy retaliates by increasing the volume. Hadley is ordered to break into Andy's office by the warden, and Andy is promptly placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. When he emerges, he tells his buddies that the stretch was the easiest time he'd ever spent in the hole, since he spent it listening to Mozart's Figaro for. When the other inmates tell him that's improbable, he talks about the power of hope in jail and how hope can keep them going. Andy disagrees with Red, who claims that hope is a dangerous thing in a place like Shawshank and advises Andy to get used to life without it. Andy indicates that Brooks did just that, and Red storms out of the table enraged. Red has a second parole hearing not long after, and he finds he's been in prison for 30 years. He says the same things he said 10 years ago, but without any enthusiasm. His parole has been denied yet again. Andy presents him with a harmonica to mark his 30th year, to which Red responds by presenting Andy with a large Marilyn Monroe poster to commemorate his 10th year. 4 years after the Mozart incident, the state senate ultimately decides that Andy will not be removed from office with another check. As a result, they give him a $500 a year budget to build his library. Andy makes good use of it, forming partnerships with reading clubs and organizations to build the best jail library in the state, which he named after Brooks. Andy begins mentoring inmates who want to acquire their high school diplomas so they can find a solid career once they're released, thanks to the expanded library and more materials. Warden Norton, meantime, takes advantage of Andy's knowledge and devises a system to put inmates to work on public projects that he wins by outbidding other contractors. Prisoners are cheap labor. He will occasionally let other contractors to score jobs if the bribe is sufficient. Andy launders the money by opening multiple accounts in various banks, as well as several investments, under the guise of Randall Stevens, a man who only exists on paper, which Andy invented himself using his understanding of the system and mail order forms. Randall Stevens has a birth certificate, social security number, and driver's license in his possession. If anyone ever looks into the scheme, they'll be chasing a man who only lives on paper. Andy tells Red about it, explaining that he had to learn how to be a crook in prison. Tommy, Gil Bellows, is a teenage prisoner who comes to Shawshank to spend time for breaking and entering in 1965. Tommy is a laid-back, gregarious, and well-liked convict who is befriended by both Andy and Red. When Tommy confesses that he's been in and out of prison since he was 13, Andy proposes that Tommy go into anything other than theft because he doesn't seem to be very good at it. Tommy is moved by Andy's suggestion, and he asks Andy to assist him in obtaining his high school equivalency credential. Tommy is a wonderful student, but when it comes to taking the exam, he becomes angry and crumples it up before throwing it away. Andy manages to retrieve it and send it in any case. Tommy inquires about Andy's situation, which Red clarifies. Tommy is extremely upset after hearing the account. He then tells Andy and Red about a past cellmate from another prison who boasted about assassinating a pro golfer and his lover at the country club where he worked. The woman's husband, a banker, was convicted of the killings and sentenced to prison. With this new information, Andy speaks with the warden, full of optimism, expecting Norton to assist him in obtaining a new trial with Tommy as a witness. Norton's reaction is the polar opposite of Andy's expectations. When Andy insists that he would never expose the money laundering methods he has set up for Norton over the years, the warden becomes enraged and sentences him to a month in solitary confinement. The detainees debate the punishment, claiming that it is the longest period of solitary confinement they have ever heard of. They also discover that Andy may, in fact, be innocent and has spent nearly 2 decades in prison for a. Tommy receives notification from the Board of Education that he has passed the exam and is now the proud owner of a high school diploma. Andy smiles a little as he receives the news from a guard in his solitary cell. Tommy is later brought outdoors late at night for a private discussion with the warden. Warden Norton asks him if the account he told Andy is genuine and if he will testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy agrees wholeheartedly. Before indicating to Hadley to shoot him, the warden smiles at him. When the warden pays Andy a visit in solitary, he informs him that Tommy attempted to flee and Hadley was forced to shoot him. Andy isn't convinced by Norton's narrative and informs him that everything has come to a halt and that he will no longer work for him. If Andy refuses to work for him, the warden threatens to close the library, burn all the books, and send him to a different cell in a different part of the prison with the most dangerous inmates. He then departs, ordering Andy to spend another month in solitary confinement to consider his options. When Andy is finally let out of solitary, he and Red have a conversation in which Andy tells about how much he loved his wife and how he feels responsible for her death, despite the fact that he didn't fire the trigger. He then goes on to discuss his plans if he ever gets out of prison. He talks about Zihuatanejo, a seaside resort on Mexico's Pacific coast, where he wants to live and run a hotel for the rest of his life. He then asks Red if he wants to join him, but Red declines, claiming that he is too far gone like Brooks. He then goes on to condemn Andy for allowing Hope to play with his head in such a way, claiming that it will only kill him. Andy agrees and is about to walk out the door when he asks Red if he is familiar with the Buxton, Maine region. He then describes a specific hay field with a large oak tree at the end of the stone wall to Red. He then wants Red to promise him that, if he is ever released, he will go to that oak tree and recover something hidden amid the stones, but he won't tell what it is. Red makes promises, but he is concerned about his friend's mental state. His fears are compounded when he finds that Andy has requested a 6-foot rope from Haywood. Andy may have finally reached his breaking point and is set to commit suicide, according to Red. In the meantime, Norton asks Andy to shine his shoes and dry clean his suit before retiring for the night. When Andy gets back to his cell, the guards turn off the lights for the night. It was the longest night of Red's life. He says Andy has not returned the morning call and is not waiting in front of his phone like he is every morning. Andy gets yelled at by the guard, who walks to his cell expecting to discover a critically ill or dead Andy. Norton, on the other hand, is disturbed when he discovers Andy's shoes in his shoebox rather than his own. The alarm then sounds, alerting the convict that he or she has gone AWOL. Norton goes to Andy's cell, which is now empty, and demands an explanation. Hadley calls Red in, but Red claims he has no knowledge of Andy's plans. Norton begins throwing Andy's sculpted pebbles around the jail as he becomes increasingly aggressive and paranoid. When he throws one at Andy's Raquel Welch poster, which had previously been occupied by Marilyn Monroe and Rita Hayworth, the rock punches through and into the wall. Norton rips the poster from the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel large enough for a man to crawl through. Andy tried to carve his name on his cell wall many years ago, not long after obtaining his rock hammer, when a chunk of it came off, as told in a series of flashback sequences narrated by Red. Andy, who is interested in geology, understood that the material used to construct a wall might be used to dig a hole if he ever needed to flee. Andy started by ordering a huge Rita Hayworth poster to cover the hole. He subsequently spent years digging with his rock hammer at night and stuffing dirt from his profession into his pockets, which he would later unload in the courtyard on his morning walks. Andy decided it was time to go after Tommy was dead. Andy carried Norton's clothes underneath his own to his cell during the previous night's thunderstorm, earning a lucky break when no one, even Red, saw Norton's sparkling black shoes on his feet. He escaped through his hole, packing several of his valuables, some papers, and Norton's clothes into a plastic bag that he attached to himself with the rope he'd requested. The tunnel he dug led him to a spot between two jail walls where he discovered a sewer main line. He pounded the sewer line with a rock multiple times in sync with the lightning strikes, eventually breaking it open. Andy emerged in a creek beyond the walls after crawling through 500 yards of raw sewage contained in the conduit. Later, a search team discovered his jail clothes, a bar of soap, and a battered rock hammer. Andy walks into the Maine National Bank in Portland, where he had stashed Norton's money, while the warden and Red are investigating Andy's brilliant escape. He closes the account and goes away with a cashier's check using his assumed name of Randall Stevens and all of the relevant papers. He asks them to put a parcel in the mail for him before he leaves. He visits about a dozen more local banks, eventually amassing a total of $370,000. Warden Norton's accounting records, as well as Andy's written confessions and testimony, are included in the package, which is given directly to the Portland Daily Bugle newspaper. Soon later, Maine State Police and many media descended on Shawshank Prison to cover the unfolding tale. Hadley is apprehended and brought away by state police for the murder of Tommy. Red claims he overheard unverified accusations that Hadley began sobbing like a little child in the backseat of the police squad car as he was being hauled away. When Warden saw Hadley being brought away in a police car and the local district attorney enter the prison with several police officers brandishing a warrant for Norton's arrest, he became concerned. Norton ultimately unlocks his office safe, which he hadn't opened since Andy escaped, and instead of his books, he discovers the Bible he had given Andy, along with a note to the warden stating that he was correct, salvation does lie within. When Norton opens the book of Exodus, he discovers that all of the pages have been hacked out in the shape of Andy's rock hammer. As the cops beat down on his door, Norton returns to his desk, pulls out a little pistol, and shoots him. Red wonders if the warden considered how Andy could ever have gotten the best of him. Just before drawing the shot. Red receives a postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas, with nothing written on it shortly after. Red interprets this as a sign that Andy has made it to freedom in Mexico. Red and his pals pass the time by reminiscing about Andy's escapades, with a few embellishments, but Red becomes depressed as he misses him. In 1967, at Red's next parole hearing, he tells the parole board that the term rehabilitated was made up to justify. He then goes on to say how much he regrets his previous actions, not because he's in jail, but because he realizes how bad they were. He then asks the board to stop wasting his time and leave him alone, claiming that he will have to live with that for the rest of his life. His request for release has finally been granted. He goes to the same places Brooks did to live and work, even witnessing Brooks' statement etched into the wooden beam. He passes a pawn shop with multiple firearms in the window on a regular basis. He considers returning to prison because he feels he has no life outside of prison, where he has spent the majority of his adult life, but he remembers the promise he made to Andy. He then discloses that he was gazing at the compasses behind the rifles rather than the guns themselves, and that he purchased one. Red takes Andy's advice and hitchhikes to Buxton, where he finds the stone wall Andy mentioned. There is a giant black stone, as Andy mentioned. A little box lies beneath, holding a big sum of money and instructions to come find him in Zihuatanejo, though he does not specify the city just yet. He also claims to be in need of someone who can get goods for a project. Red instantly realizes the power of hope and is elated by the sensations he is experiencing. Red violates parole and leaves the halfway house, unconcerned because no one is expected to conduct an extended quest for an old criminal like him, as he carves a new message in the wooden beam that reads, "Brooks was here, so was Red." Red boards a bus to Fort Hancock, where he enters Mexico for the first time. The two pals are finally reunited on a Pacific Coast beach, just as Andy had wished for.